Berenice learned very early that a crown did not weigh because of the gold, but because of the void it left when the backing of Rome was absent. As a child, she had seen her father, Herod Agrippa I, enter the palace with the firm stride of someone who knew how to greet two worlds without fully bowing to either. For the most pious Jews, he was a king who had wept in public, offered sacrifices, and spoken with the tongue of the law. For the Romans, he was a useful ally, docile when it suited him, dazzling when it was necessary to impress. Around him, the purple curtains, the soldiers, the scribes, and the priests seemed to maintain the same delicate balance that upheld all of Judea, one hand over the temple and the other extended towards Caesar. She remembered the shine of silver vessels at banquets, the smell of incense, her father's deep voice silencing the room with a single glance. She also recalled his piety, the way he washed his hands before entering certain chambers, or how he paused before the messengers from Jerusalem with an attention that was not feigned. Berenice, still a child, then understood that power was not inherited like a closed wound, but like a scar that could reopen at any moment. When Agrippa I died, the household fell apart in a single night. The rooms filled with whispers. The servants walked faster, and the visitors no longer bowed with the same certainty. The world that had been solid turned into negotiation. Berenice watched her brother Agrippa II grow up in that shadow, educated by Rome, prepared to govern territories that did not fully belong to him. She, on the other hand, was handed over to the uncertain movement of marriages, as if each alliance could restore a stability that no longer existed. She married young to a man from another branch of the royal family. Then she became a widow. Later, she remarried and lost everything again. Each court had its language, its perfumes, its way of measuring a queen by the utility she could offer. In one city, she learned to smile among Hellenistic columns. In another, to be silent before the envoys of Rome. In another, to pretend that sadness was mere fatigue. Berenice changed residences, dresses, and retinues, but not her fate. She remained a visible woman, too noble to be ignored and too Jewish to be accepted without reservations. When she returned to Agrippa II's side, she no longer came back as an obedient girl, but as a widow capable of reading faces and anticipating dangers. Her brother's court had the refinement of a house accustomed to survival. There were maps, reports, tributes, tax lists, and visits from men who spoke with the exact tone of those who know that every word can serve as evidence before a Roman governor. Agrippa needed her. She understood that. Between them was a closeness made of blood, intelligence, and a loyalty that others preferred to call scandal because they could not comprehend it. Berenice received ambassadors, listened to petitions, observed the temperament of the priests and the bitterness of the notables. As the tension in Judea grew, the resentment against the Roman officials became more visible. The contempt for taxes, for desecrations, for the custom of treating the temple as a vault and its people as a subdued multitude. She, who knew the pride of her own people and the cruelty of foreigners, began to suspect that her lineage was situated right at the point where the hatred of both sides intersected. It was in that climate that she witnessed, alongside Agrippa, the appearance of a prisoner named Paul of Tarsus. The man spoke with a disconcerting serenity, with no visible fear of authority or accusation. His words floated between ancient faith and a new promise, between the law of the fathers and a truth that was said for all. Berenice watched him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. That traveling Jew seemed to belong to the same divided world as she did, but he had chosen to turn his division into a message. However, before she could stop to think about that strange destiny, news arrived from Jerusalem. Gessius Florus was demanding money from the sacred treasury, money from the temple, money from God, taken by the hand of a tax collector. Berenice felt something tense in the air, like a string about to snap. In the streets of the holy city, voices began to rise, first in indignation, then in rage. And in her brother's face, she saw for the first time a concern that could not be disguised by any diplomacy. The news found her still with the dust of the road on the edges of her mantle, and her hair tied back with the sobriety of one who has offered herself to God. She had arrived in Jerusalem to fulfill a vow, and as dictated by the custom of piety, had cut part of her hair as a sign of dedication. Her feet, accustomed to the polished stones of the palace and the courtyards of the court, touched this time the rough stone of the holy city without the protection of sandals. The cold of dawn crept up her legs as she crossed the outer courts of the temple, and for a moment she felt that the voluntary humiliation of the rite brought her closer than ever to the people surrounding her. Jerusalem was boiling. Pilgrims from distant villages mingled with merchants, priests, scribes, and Roman soldiers who watched from elevated corners. Prayers were heard, discussions about sacrifices, haggling for animals for the offering, the clinking of coins, and the uncomfortable murmur of a fear still unnamed. Then came the offense. Gessio Floro had demanded money from the sacred treasury, as if the temple were an imperial granary and not the house of the God of Israel. Indignation spread through the streets with the speed of a spark on dry oil. Some young men, with a rage almost joyful, began to gather coins in baskets and to beg for alms for poor Floro, mocking the procurator with reckless audacity. The mockery did not last long. Rome's response fell upon the city like an iron door. The soldiers advanced in formation, pushing the crowd with the edges of their shields. There were screams, blows, the crash of broken vessels, and the horrible sound of bodies falling onto the stone. Houses were looted, doors torn off, hands raised pleading for mercy that no one granted. Berenice, from a gallery of the palace, saw a mother running with a child in her arms, saw an old man collapse beside a well, saw blood mix with dust and oil. And she understood that the rumor of rebellion was no longer just a rumor. She did not wait for permission to leave. She descended the stairs with her heart pounding in her chest, still barefoot, dressed in a light tunic that the journey and grief had rendered sober. She wore no diadem or visible jewelry, only the naked dignity of a woman who wanted to speak as a daughter of Judea and not as a princess of Rome. The guards looked at her with brief hesitation, for a princess could be an ally, but also a hindrance. She did not give them time to decide. She crossed the courtyard, stepped outside, and headed for Floro's tribunal with a tense face and eyes ablaze with contained anger. The procurator received her seated, surrounded by scribes and soldiers. His expression was that of a man who had learned to confuse authority with impunity. Berenice stopped before him, and in that instant, she seemed taller than all those around her. Barefoot, with her hair cut and her mantle clinging to her body from the dust of the road, she spoke to him with a firm voice that only trembled at the end of each sentence. She pleaded with him to stop the slaughter, to withdraw his men, to not turn the indignation of a holy city into an endless war. She reminded him that he was not dealing with bandits, but with a desperate people, that a little moderation could save thousands of lives. Floro barely looked at her. Perhaps her accent annoyed him, perhaps her beauty, perhaps the mere idea that a woman would come to speak to him of justice. He made an indifferent gesture, as if swatting away an insect. Then he turned his face to his officers and gave a curt order. The response was immediate. The soldiers moved, and the space around Berenice became dangerous in a heartbeat. She caught sight of a spear, a fist, the gleam of a sword. There was no time for more pride. She retreated with her heart frozen and had to flee before the violence consumed her as well. She returned to the palace with forgotten sandals, empty hands, and shame burning in her throat. She sent messengers to the higher authorities, denounced the massacre, and asked for intervention before it was too late. But as she drafted the words, she already knew they had arrived too late for the faith of the crowd. Outside, in the streets of Jerusalem, the people no longer spoke of protest, but of vengeance. And in the silence that followed the first deaths, Berenice understood that her plea had been heard only by the stones. The message of distress reached Agrippa like a bad harvest, not with a single blow, but with a succession of tense faces, doors flung wide open, and servants who avoided looking him in the eye. When he finally set out for Jerusalem, he did not enter as a triumphant king, but as a man who knows that reason sometimes arrives too late. Berenice walked beside him, wrapped in a dark cloak, her face hardened by the humiliation of the previous days. She had lost the innocence of believing that a single noble gesture could repair the offense of Rome. Now all that remained was the more fragile hope that at least words could quell the fire. The crowd gathered in a nearby plaza to the sacred precincts, where the echo of voices rose against the stones like smoke. There were priests in light robes, notable figures with stern faces, indignant merchants, elders who remembered more stable times, and young men with clenched fists and quick breaths, eager for any phrase that sounded like surrender. The factions of Jerusalem were present in every corner. The prudent remained silent with pressed lips, the fanatics pushed forward, and the younger ones looked at Agrippa as one looks at a man about to pronounce his own sentence. The king spoke with a voice trained for audiences, capable of filling with gravity without losing clarity. He recalled the power of Rome, not as an abstract threat, but as a living machinery, disciplined legions, countless provinces, inexhaustible treasures, generals who had crushed kingdoms richer and older than Judea. He said that wrath was not strategy, that pride could ruin a people faster than an enemy. Berenice listened beside him, and although each word pained her, she knew none were false. Before that fiery crowd, her brother's speech was the uncomfortable voice of reality. There was a murmur of doubt. Some moderates nodded, not out of obedience, but because the vision of a war against Rome seemed to them an open grave. Then Agrippa took the fatal step. He asked them to agree, at least for the moment, to obey the governor of Syria, while a formal accusation against Florus was presented. He promised that justice would come through political means, not through spears. In that instant, the air changed. What had been uncertainty turned into offense. An isolated shout rose from the back of the square, then another and another, until the entire crowd seemed to breathe rage. Berenice tried to speak as well. She stepped forward, and for a moment her tall and solemn figure produced a brief silence. She spoke of the dead, of terrified children, of the risk that Jerusalem would be turned to ash by a war they could not win. But her words, though sincere, fell upon the accumulated resentment like water on hot stone. To some, she was the king's sister. To others, the princess who had lived among the luxuries of a house favored by Rome. To the angriest, a beautiful woman trying to soften the whip with her voice. They listened to her without hearing her. The response came in waves. The rebels, growing in number, began to take fortresses and checkpoints. The sacrifices offered in the name of the emperor were rejected, as if cutting that gesture were to sever the last cord connecting Judea to Roman dominion. In streets and courtyards, young men armed with stones, knives, and desperate bravery ripped imperial symbols from their roots. Banners were trampled, envoys insulted, the names of the Herodians pronounced with venom. Then the fires began. First, it was a wing of Agrippa's palace, then the warehouses, and later the halls where Berenice had received ambassadors, listened to petitions, and contemplated maps on tables of fragrant wood. The flames climbed the curtains, licked the ceilings, and bit into the chests and archives. The smoke mingled the smell of resin with that of burning scrolls, and Berenice felt that not only was a house being consumed, but an entire life. Letters from her father, wedding objects, Eastern fabrics, childhood memories, material proof that there had once been a place to belong. The queen who had tried to be a bridge watched as the bridge burned beneath her feet. When the crowd began to shout traitors, she understood that there was no turning back. Jerusalem no longer recognized her as a mediator. It had expelled her from the heart of the city. Agrippa took her by the arm with a firmness that concealed his trembling. They left amid smoke, insults, and stones, escorted by a small guard and the bitter certainty of having lost something more than a building. They had lost their moral homeland. As they left the city, Berenice looked back just once. The walls stood out black against the red glow of the fire. She then understood that if the rebellion triumphed, Judea would be annihilated, and if Rome prevailed, so would it. She chose not out of love for the empire, but out of fear of the abyss. It was a choice without glory, made with clenched teeth and eyes dry from crying inside. From that day on, the princess who had wanted to save Jerusalem was condemned to appear as an ally of those who would ultimately destroy it. The road out of Jerusalem began to seem like a line drawn on ash. For days they traveled among Roman outposts, silent villages, and makeshift camps where the air smelled of damp leather, sweat, and iron. Berenice did not cry at first. The humiliation was too recent, too vivid. Only when the column stopped on a hill from which she could still see in the distance the glow of the city did she allow herself to close her eyes. There, for the first time, she understood that war was no longer a possibility, but a force that had begun to devour the world. Vespasian arrived in the east like men who need not promise anything, because their mere presence imposes order. He was burly, weathered by ancient campaigns, with the calm of one who knows how to wait without losing control. His legions advanced with an almost ritual precision. Palisades raised at dusk, ditches opened with discipline, standards planted in the ground as if claiming every inch of the horizon. Where they passed, fortresses fell, cities surrendered, and the rebels learned that Rome did not respond with rage but with method. Agrippa II put his resources at the service of that tide. He knew paths, lineages, local grudges, names of leaders, and ancient debts. Berenice, for her part, discovered that her usefulness could be a form of survival. She received emissaries, conveyed messages, measured wills. Her figure, dressed in sober purple and restrained gold, made her way among Roman officials and Eastern aristocrats with the confidence of one who has learned that a glance can tilt a negotiation. She brought gifts, yes, but above all, she brought something more valuable: prestige. Her name, linked to the Herodian house, made some hesitate before closing doors. And in war, a doubt can be worth a city. When the struggle for power erupted in Rome, the Eastern army became the decisive board. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, names that arrived at the camp like gusts of dust and rumors. Berenice understood that the fate of Judea also depended on that distant storm. Vespasian hesitated to proclaim himself emperor, and the men around him weighed each possibility with caution. Then she intervened, not with speeches, but with a network of contacts, letters, gifts, and the calm authority of one who knows how to speak to the interests of the powerful without losing composure. Her support was not a decorative gesture. It helped sustain Vespasian's cause when uncertainty could still shatter everything. It was in that climate of campaigning, maps, and irrevocable decisions that she truly met Titus. Upon seeing him for the first time, Berenice discerned something rare among the Romans: a discipline without harshness, an ambition that did not need to shout, a severe beauty sharpened by command. He observed her with the attention of a man accustomed to reading danger in faces, yet he did not find in her a supplicant. He saw a queen without a kingdom, yes, but also a woman who understood war better than many generals. They began with brief conversations, first in the presence of others, then alone, at the edge of tents or on crumbling walls, while the sun fell on the dust. They spoke of strategy, besieged cities, the obstinacy of men, and the price of clemency. Berenice defended the memory of Jerusalem with a sadness that was not weakness. Titus replied that a prolonged rebellion multiplied the dead. Neither fully yielded, and precisely for that reason, a dangerous intimacy was born between them. She saw behind the uniform a man capable of command, but also of restraint. He saw behind her origin a brilliant intelligence, a dignity that did not bend even before the victor. In the margins of those conversations, something began that neither of them named. An overly long pause, a hand that did not withdraw quickly. The feeling that, amid a war that destroyed temples and palaces, a secret territory had emerged where it was still possible to recognize one another without hatred. But each gaze returned to the same point: Jerusalem. She thought of the temple, of the city that burned in memory. He thought of the need to end the campaign before Rome grew impatient. Love between them was born with the sound of military horns. When Vespasian was proclaimed emperor and departed for Rome, Titus inherited the campaign as one inherits a sword and a sentence. Berenice watched him take command with the serenity of a man who could no longer afford to waver. The legions set out, heavy, precise, countless. From a dusty height, she watched as the army raised its camps before the walls of Jerusalem. The tents spread over the land like a second city. And there, under the standards of Rome, she understood that the man she loved had just become the shadow that would definitively darken her homeland. From the hill where the Roman tents spread out like a city of leather and stakes, Berenice gazed at Jerusalem surrounded by a ring of smoke and hunger. The nights were filled with enemy torches and a red glow that seemed to rise from the very earth. Within the walls, broken rumors reached her. Factions killing each other, granaries set ablaze by Jewish hands so that the enemy would not find provisions, children dead from starvation, priests dragging their feet through empty courtyards, the sick huddled by dry fountains. The war, which had initially been a source of pride, had turned into a blind beast devouring its own children. Berenice lived in a state of waiting that consumed her more than the siege. Each messenger arriving from the front brought her a different and always crueler truth. She asked about the temple before she asked about herself. She inquired about the golden stones, the sacred precincts, the smoke of sacrifices, as if naming them could preserve them. When Titus could see her, he found her pale, tense, with her fingers gripping the edge of her mantle. She spoke to him with a desperate calm, pleading for him to accept an honorable surrender, to save at least the sanctuary. He listened to her with the closed face of one who has already decided too much to turn back. An invisible crack then opened between them, not of unlove, but of fate. Finally, the defenses gave way. The Romans breached the walls one after another, advancing with the precision of a tide breaking a dam. There were screams, looting, collapsed columns, the clatter of hooves on the stones, and the unbearable smell of burning wood. Berenice was not there to witness the first fire, but she felt the echo of the catastrophe in the faces of the survivors. The Second Temple fell amidst flames and blood in the year 70. When she learned that the sanctuary had been consumed, she felt an emptiness so immense that she could not even cry. It was as if they had ripped away her past, her tongue, her childhood, and her faith all at once. For Rome, Titus returned as the victor who had quelled the great rebellion of Judea. For his people, he became the man who had let the heart of the holy city burn. Berenice remained suspended between both judgments, unable to belong entirely to either. However, she did not distance herself from him. She followed him after the war, when victory turned into a parade and then into court. By the year 75, she traveled to Rome alongside Agrippa II and entered the imperial palace as a queen without a kingdom, but not without presence. Her mature beauty, solemn bearing, and intelligence captivated and unsettled those around her. She appeared beside Titus with a closeness that fueled whispers in the halls, in the taverns, and in the Senate. Rome watched her as a dangerous intruder. They compared her to Cleopatra, as if any Eastern woman who influenced a Roman must be a threat to the order of the world. The people looked at her with hostile curiosity, the senators with cold distrust. How could they accept a Jewish queen, daughter of a dynasty that had always wavered between obedience and pride, as a future empress? Berenice then learned that sharing the bed of power was not enough to be part of it. Her jewels, her manners, her knowledge of Greek and Latin, her patience at banquets, nothing erased the fact that she was a foreigner. And more than a foreigner, a living reminder of a war that Rome wanted to turn into triumph and forget as a wound. When Vespasian died and Titus ascended to the throne in 79, the pressure became unbearable. The city demanded a complete emperor, not a man bound to a queen who aroused suspicion and passions. One day he called her with a voice lower than usual and did not look at her immediately. Berenice understood before he spoke. He ordered her to leave, not as an enemy, nor as a declared punishment, but as a political necessity. And that form of expulsion was the cruelest because it pretended not to be one. They parted with pain, with that terrible stillness of those who have survived a war but do not survive a decision. She left Rome without an imperial crown, her head held high out of habit, and her soul torn inside. Titus remained surrounded by marble, guards, and obligations. They both knew it was not a farewell born of will, but of the relentless machinery of power. When he died a few years later, in 81, his name passed into the archives of emperors. Berenice faded into the margins like an inscription eroded by rain. No one knew for certain where she ended up. Perhaps she returned to the east. Perhaps she remained suspended in some silent residence, surrounded by closed chests and memories without a homeland. In her later years, we imagine her looking at the objects she kept from Jerusalem and Rome: a darkened jewel, a fragment of fabric, a worn coin, a small amulet, a letter folded until nearly illegible. She touched them one by one as if running her hand over the ruins of her own life. And in that final silence, heavier than any defeat, Perhaps she understood that she had been queen of two worlds and mistress of none.